Imagine this. In a world obsessed with electric cars and futuristic tech, Americans are falling back in love with a machine built decades ago. Not because it's new, but because it feels real. And the company behind it never actually disappeared. Long before touchscreens, autopilot systems, or software updates defined what a car was, there was a time when driving wasn't about convenience, it was about identity. A time when the sound of an engine meant freedom. And no company captured that feeling better than Ford. But the story of Ford didn't begin with power, popularity, or nostalgia. It began with frustration. Henry Ford wasn't trying to build a luxury symbol. He wasn't chasing status or prestige. He was obsessed with one radical idea. What if ordinary people could afford extraordinary mobility? At the start of the 20th century, cars weren't for the public. They were toys for the wealthy. Owning one meant you belonged to a different class entirely. Ford hated that. He believed mobility shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a tool. But belief alone didn't build cars. His early attempts failed. Businesses collapsed. Investors pulled out. Critics dismissed him. To many, he looked like another dreamer chasing an impossible idea. But what they didn't understand was this. Ford wasn't trying to improve the automobile. He was trying to redesign society around it. Because when people could move freely, they could work farther, live differently, dream bigger. That's why in 1903, when Ford Motor Company was officially formed, it wasn't just another startup. It was a quiet challenge to the status quo. The early cars weren't perfect. They weren't flashy, but they were practical. And practicality, in a world built on exclusivity, was revolutionary. Then came the Model T. Not the fastest, not the most beautiful, but the most important. Because for the first time, a car wasn't designed for the rich. It was designed for everyone. Farmers, factory workers, teachers, shop owners. People who had never imagined owning a vehicle suddenly saw it as possible. But there was still one massive problem. Even an affordable car was useless if it took too long to build. Demand exploded. Production couldn't keep up. And Ford faced a choice. Stay small and exclusive, or reinvent how things were made. What happened next didn't just change Ford. It changed the modern world. Instead of crafting cars slowly by hand, Ford introduced something radical. The moving assembly line. A system where the product moved, not the worker. Each person had a simple task. No wasted motion. No unnecessary delay. Suddenly, building a car didn't take over 12 hours. It took less than 2. That single decision transformed manufacturing forever. And something even more surprising happened. As production costs dropped, so did prices. More people bought cars. More demand meant more production. More production meant more jobs. And Ford did something unheard of. He doubled worker wages. Not out of charity, but strategy. Because a worker who could afford the product would become a customer. It was capitalism redesigned from the inside. And America changed almost overnight. Roads expanded. Cities grew outward. Suburbs began to form. Freedom wasn't theoretical anymore. It had wheels. If you're enjoying how this story is unfolding and want to see more real business stories that shaped America, make sure to like and subscribe, because this journey only gets deeper from here. By the 1920s, Ford wasn't just selling cars. It was shaping culture. The Model T wasn't just transportation. It was independence. Teenagers drove away from home for the first time. Families traveled beyond their towns. Work opportunities expanded. America began to stretch itself. But success has a strange side effect. It can make you resistant to change. While the world evolved, Ford became attached to what had made it successful. The Model T dominated for years, but competitors started watching, learning, adapting. Companies like General Motors realized something Ford didn't want to accept. People didn't just want function anymore. They wanted style, choice, identity, different colors, different models, different status signals. Ford believed simplicity was strength. GM believed variety was power. And slowly, that difference started to matter. Consumers began to shift. Because once mobility became normal, emotion became the next frontier. Cars weren't just tools anymore. They were reflections of personality. And Ford's reluctance to adapt began to cost them. Sales slipped. Competitors rose. And the company that had once revolutionized the world suddenly faced something unfamiliar. Being second. But Ford wouldn't stay down forever. Because deep inside the company's DNA was the same question Henry Ford once asked. How do we bring something powerful to the everyday person? And that question would lead to one of the most iconic machines ever created. Not just a car, but a symbol. One that would redefine performance and bring emotion back into American driving. That story begins next. By the time Ford realized the world had changed, it was already losing ground. The Model T had built an empire, but the same simplicity that once made it revolutionary was now making it outdated. Consumers wanted more than reliability. They wanted expression. And Ford's biggest rival understood that perfectly. While Ford stayed loyal to a single dominant design, competitors began offering different styles, colors, and features. Choice became the new innovation. Suddenly, buying a car wasn't just about reaching somewhere. It was about how you wanted to arrive. Ford had built mobility. Now the market demanded identity. And that shift created pressure inside the company. After years of dominance, Ford was forced to admit something uncomfortable. The Model T era was ending. Replacing it wouldn't just be a product decision. It would be a philosophical one. Because stepping away from the Model T meant letting go of the idea that simplicity alone could win forever. In 1927, Ford shut down Model T production. Factories went silent. Assembly lines stopped. For months, nothing new was built. It was a massive risk. But when the Model A arrived, it wasn't just an upgrade. It was a signal. Ford was willing to evolve. The Model A brought style back into the equation. It offered color options, improved design, better driving experience, and consumers responded. Ford regained momentum. But another storm was already forming. The Great Depression, economic collapse, reshaped American life. Millions lost jobs. Purchasing power vanished. And suddenly, the auto industry faced a brutal reality. Even the best car meant nothing if people couldn't afford it. Ford's earlier philosophy, building for the everyday person, became its survival advantage. While luxury brands struggled, Ford's focus on accessibility kept it alive. But this period also exposed internal tensions. Labor conditions, factory expectations, worker demands, industrial growth had created opportunity, but also imbalance. Ford had once doubled wages to empower workers. Now the question became, could a company grow without losing its human foundation? Through the 1930s, Ford continued refining its lineup. Engineering improved. Design matured. But something was missing. Excitement. The world was entering a new era, and Americans were beginning to look for something beyond practicality. They wanted power, speed, presence. That desire would become even stronger after World War II. Because when soldiers returned home, they didn't want reminders of restraint. They wanted symbols of possibility. The post-war boom reshaped consumer psychology. Suburbs expanded, highways stretched across states, and the automobile became more than transport. It became lifestyle. Ford understood this shift, but translating it into a defining product wasn't easy. Competitors were aggressive, innovation was accelerating, and the market was fragmenting into segments. Family cars, luxury cars, performance cars. Youth culture was emerging as a powerful force. For the first time, young buyers mattered. They didn't just want reliability. They wanted excitement, something bold, something emotional. And Ford saw an opportunity. Instead of chasing luxury, instead of competing only on function, what if they built something that felt alive? Something accessible, but thrilling. The idea was simple. Create a car that looked fast, even when standing still. A car that felt personal, affordable, stylish, and powerful enough to excite a new generation. That vision led to one of the most important moments in Ford's history. In 1964, the Mustang was introduced, and it didn't just enter the market. It exploded into culture. The Mustang wasn't positioned as elite. It wasn't meant only for enthusiasts. It was designed for the everyday driver who wanted something more. Sleek design, long hood, short rear deck, aggressive stance, and a price point that made performance feel attainable. Young Americans fell in love instantly. It represented freedom, but with personality. It wasn't just about going somewhere. It was about being seen while getting there. Sales surged. Ford dealerships couldn't keep up. The Mustang became more than a product. It became a statement. And in doing so, Ford rediscovered something powerful. Emotion sells. Identity sells. Dreams sell. Not just function. If you're enjoying how these defining moments shaped American culture and want more deep dives into the machines that changed society, make sure to like and subscribe, because this journey is far from over. But success brings new expectations. Once you create excitement, you have to sustain it. And the late 1960s would test Ford's ability to balance performance with responsibility. Because as engines grew louder, so did public concerns, safety debates, fuel efficiency questions, environmental awareness. The industry was about to face pressures it had never encountered before. And Ford would need to adapt once again, because the next era wouldn't be defined by speed alone. It would be shaped by survival, and the road ahead wouldn't be as smooth. The Mustang had given Ford something priceless again: cultural relevance. It wasn't just selling cars anymore. It was shaping desire. But as the late 1960s rolled into the 1970s, the world outside the showroom began to change in ways no automaker could ignore. Fuel, once taken for granted, suddenly became uncertain. Global tensions disrupted supply. Gas prices rose. Long lines formed at stations. And the same drivers who once craved power now began asking a different question. How far can this car take me on a tank? Muscle alone was no longer enough. Efficiency became survival. For a company whose legacy was built on big engines and bold performance, this was a difficult pivot. The oil crisis didn't just hurt sales, it forced an identity check. Americans weren't abandoning cars, but they were reconsidering what they wanted from them. Practicality returned to the spotlight. Smaller vehicles, better fuel economy, lower costs. Foreign competitors, particularly from Japan, began entering the market with cars that were lighter, simpler, and more efficient. And American consumers noticed. Ford faced pressure from two sides: keep its emotional legacy alive, while also meeting a new demand for restraint. The 1970s became a decade of experimentation. New models attempted to balance performance and economy. Engineering priorities shifted. Regulations increased. Safety standards tightened. And emissions rules forced technological innovation. The industry was no longer just about building exciting machines. It was about building responsible ones. But transitions are rarely smooth. Some decisions worked, others didn't. Brand identity became harder to maintain, and the confidence Ford once projected began to feel less certain. Yet beneath the surface, the company was learning something crucial. Adaptability mattered more than nostalgia, because clinging to the past in a changing world wasn't loyalty. It was risk. The 1980s arrived with renewed optimism. Technology was advancing rapidly. Computers were entering workplaces. Design language evolved, and Ford started focusing on modernizing its lineup. Aerodynamic styling replaced boxy forms. Fuel efficiency improved. Production techniques advanced. The company introduced vehicles aimed at everyday drivers who wanted reliability without sacrificing comfort. Ford wasn't trying to dominate culture the way the Mustang had. Instead, it was trying to rebuild trust. And for a time, it worked. Sales stabilized. Confidence returned. But the competitive landscape had permanently shifted. Globalization meant Ford wasn't just competing with American brands anymore. It was competing with the world. Every innovation was matched, every weakness exposed, and consumer expectations grew higher. By the 1990s, a new kind of vehicle began reshaping American roads. The SUV, larger than a sedan, more versatile than a truck, practical for families, powerful enough for long trips. Ford saw the opportunity early. The Explorer became one of the defining vehicles of the decade. It represented security, capability, space, and for many families, it replaced the traditional station wagon. Once again, Ford found itself aligned with a cultural shift. Americans weren't just commuting anymore. They were traveling, relocating, exploring. The automobile had become an extension of lifestyle. But success also brought scrutiny. Safety concerns, product recalls, public trust challenges. The modern media landscape amplified every issue. Brand perception became fragile, and Ford had to navigate not just engineering challenges, but reputational ones. At the same time, the digital revolution was beginning. Computers entered cars. Electronics replaced purely mechanical systems, and the automobile slowly transformed from a machine into a platform. Connectivity, comfort, convenience. Consumers wanted vehicles that fit into their lives seamlessly. Ford adapted, introducing new technologies, enhancing interiors, refining performance. But a deeper transformation was approaching, because the next challenge wouldn't just be about design or efficiency. It would be existential. What happens when the very concept of an engine is questioned? When power isn't measured in horsepower, but in battery capacity? The industry stood at the edge of another revolution, and Ford once again would need to decide: leader, follow, or risk fading into memory. If you're enjoying seeing how each era forced Ford to reinvent itself, make sure to like and subscribe, because the biggest transformation was still ahead. Because the 21st century wouldn't be about bigger engines or sleeker designs. It would be about redefining what a car even is. And survival would depend not on tradition, but on vision. The 21st century didn't arrive with a roar. It arrived quietly, through software updates, through silent motors, through a growing realization that the automobile was about to change more in 20 years than it had in the previous 100. For Ford, this wasn't just another adjustment. This was the moment where history could become a burden or a foundation. Because while new companies emerged promising fully electric futures, Ford carried something they didn't. Legacy, trust, memory. But legacy alone doesn't guarantee survival. And by the late 2000s, the global financial crisis pushed the entire auto industry to the edge. Factories slowed, demand dropped, uncertainty spread. Major names faced collapse. The world watched as American automakers struggled to stay afloat. Ford faced the same storm, but its response would become one of the defining moments in its modern identity. Instead of waiting for rescue, Ford restructured, refocused, rebuilt from within. It streamlined operations, prioritized core strengths, and prepared for a future that looked nothing like its past. This wasn't just financial survival. It was strategic rebirth, because the next challenge wasn't economic. It was technological. Electric vehicles were no longer experimental concepts. They were becoming inevitable. Environmental concerns, regulatory pressure, consumer awareness, all pointed toward a world where combustion engines would slowly lose dominance. For a company whose myth was built on the sound of engines, silence felt unfamiliar. But ignoring the shift wasn't an option. So Ford made a decision that reflected both courage and humility. Instead of abandoning its identity, it would reinterpret it. The Mustang, once a symbol of gasoline-powered rebellion, would be reborn in a new form. Electric, modern, but emotionally connected to its heritage. The Mustang Mach-E wasn't just a product launch. It was a statement that history could evolve without disappearing, that legacy could power innovation instead of resisting it. And consumers responded, not because it was electric, but because it still felt like a Mustang. At the same time, Ford began electrifying its most iconic strength, the truck, the F-150. For decades, it represented American durability, work, strength, reliability. Turning it electric wasn't just engineering. It was cultural risk. But the F-150 Lightning proved something important. Progress didn't have to erase familiarity. It could enhance it. Quiet torque replaced loud horsepower. Instant acceleration replaced gradual buildup. Utility remained, but the experience transformed. Ford wasn't trying to become a startup. It was trying to bridge two worlds, the mechanical past and the digital future. Software integration expanded. Connectivity improved. Driver assistance systems evolved. Vehicles became ecosystems. Updates arrived through data. Performance could improve without touching a wrench. And once again, the automobile shifted from object to experience. But perhaps the most fascinating change wasn't under the hood. It was in perception. In 2026, something unexpected began happening. While futuristic EVs dominated headlines, Americans started rediscovering something older. Classic design, retro aesthetics, mechanical honesty, vintage Mustangs, early Broncos, historic F-Series models. They weren't just collectibles. They were emotional anchors. In a hyperdigital world, analog authenticity felt refreshing. And Ford found itself uniquely positioned. Because its past wasn't just archived. It was alive. The same brand that pioneered mass production, that created muscle culture, that defined family mobility, was now operating in an age of artificial intelligence and electrification. And instead of collapsing under that contrast, it was benefiting from it. Young buyers admired heritage. Older generations trusted familiarity. Ford became a bridge between eras. Not fully nostalgic, not fully futuristic, but balanced. And that balance might be its greatest innovation yet. Because survival in modern industry isn't about speed alone, or efficiency, or even technology. It's about relevance, the ability to mean something across generations. From assembly lines to software dashboards, from roaring engines to silent talk, Ford's journey reflects something deeper than corporate endurance. It reflects adaptability, a willingness to evolve without erasing identity. And that's why, even in a world racing toward autonomy and electrification, a company born in the age of steam still matters. Because sometimes, the future doesn't belong to whoever arrives first. It belongs to whoever remembers why they started. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the most influential forces in American automotive history and want more stories about the companies shaping our world, make sure to like and subscribe, because the next story might surprise you even more.